electronically and to effectuate both the emergency procedures authorized by FOIA and the emergency ordinance, the Young Adults Advisory Council's Subcommittee on Talent, Outreach, and Engagement needs to make certain findings and determinations for the record. It's a bit cumbersome, so I ask you in advance for your patience. First, because each member of the subcommittee is participating in this meeting from a separate location, we must verify that a quorum of members is participating and that each member's voice is clear, audible, and at an appropriate volume for all of the other members. Accordingly, I'm going to conduct a roll call and ask each subcommittee member participating in this meeting to state your name and the location from which you are participating. I ask that each of you play close attention to ensure that you hear each of your colleagues. Following this roll call, we will vote to establish that every member can hear every other member. Sujit Coppola, present. Jessica Sun.
Jessica Sun, calling in from Vienna, Virginia.
Natalia Moody. Dini Mohammed.
Dini Mohammed, calling in from Entail, Virginia.
Denver Supinger. At this point, I will pass the virtual gavel to one of my subcommittee members, Miss Jessica Sun, so that I may be heard to make the requisite motion. I move that each member's voice may be adequately heard by each other member of the subcommittee.
I second the motion.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Second, having established that each member's voice may be heard by every other member, we must next establish that the emergency that compels these emergency procedures, the fact that we are meeting electronically, what type of electronic communication is being used, and how we have arranged for public access to this meeting. Therefore, I move that the state of emergency caused by the COVID-19 pandemic makes it unsafe for the committee to physically assemble and unsafe for the public to physically attend any such meeting, and that as such, FOIA's usual procedures which require the physical assembly of the subcommittee and the physical presence of the public cannot be implemented safely or practically. I move that the subcommittee may conduct this meeting electronically through a dedicated video and audio conferencing line, and that the public may access this meeting by registering through the meeting link on the Fairfax County Public Meeting Calendar at fairfaxcounty.gov/calendar/show calendar, or by calling 1-844-621-3956 and entering access code 173-592-5429. It is so moved.
I second the motion.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Finally, it is next required that all of the matters addressed on today's agenda must address the emergency itself, are necessary for continuity in Fairfax County government, and are statutorily required or necessary to continue operations and the discharge of the subcommittee's lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities. It is so moved.
I second the motion.
For the record, has anybody provided written comments in advance?
No.
Hearing none. Are there any members of the public or members of this committee that signed up in advance to speak? If so, please speak up if you're on the line. Hearing none. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak at the public hearing? If so, please spell out your name and list your speaking order. Hearing none. Okay. Graham, back over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Sujit. Appreciate it. So, a couple of things that Sujit and I discussed in terms of kind of setting up this subcommittee meeting was going over kind of two things. The first was a recap of the scoping questions that we had developed at the February subcommittee meeting, where we were focusing specifically on outreach and engagement strategies. And with an eye for kind of reviewing the work that we've done thus far in terms of brainstorming out and workshopping the questions that we had to kind of prompt the discussion about the topic. And then also, now that the subcommittees have been restructured, and workforce talent, attraction and retention has been added to the subcommittee's topics. Wanted to fold that in, and then also kind of go through a similar mode of thinking with those scoping questions, but with that workforce hat on for a second. So I have a slightly different list of scoping questions, or kind of a reprompting of those scoping questions with the workforce in mind, but it's pretty similar to what I sent out earlier. So that's kind of the first half that I was hoping to do, and it was also just to review what we have done thus far since it's been a couple of months. And then the second part was with an eye for looking forward to something that we could do kind of in the short term, in terms of providing the full committees or the full council's eventual input on this topic in a timely manner, is with the draft strategic plan, looking specifically at a couple of the chapters that are relevant to the subcommittee's work. So that's looking at effective and efficient government as one of the strategic plan chapters. And then also, and that's very, very much in line with both workforce talent attraction and also specifically to outreach and engagement. And then the second one, it's a bit peripheral, but it does overlap in some ways. It's looking at empowerment and support for residents facing vulnerability. So that's looking at specific strategies for outreach and engagement in some cases to vulnerable populations. So those seem to be the kind of the most relevant as we're going through the strategic plan that the subcommittee could take a look at, opine on, and potentially suggest either reformatting of some of these strategies or the addition of certain strategies. So that seemed to have been kind of a workflow that we could do if the subcommittee would like to, and if the full council supports it. So that seems to have been kind of the main crux of it. So that's what we had in the agenda. So any questions on that in particular, or anything you wanted to add, Suji? I know that you and I had talked about it earlier, but.
No, I think you just about covered it. I'm just kind of browsing through the scoping document right now, but nothing to add at the top.
Okay. Let me pull it up, the scoping document. A second. Okay, so can everybody see my Word document that we have here? Okay, good.
Yep.
All right, so this is from February. And so Deanie, thanks for jumping on board and reviewing the YouTube video. I knew that there was a reason for these YouTube videos, so thank you for that. Aside from just requirements, so that's good. But what we had done, Deanie, and this is for your edification as well as all of ours, for just kind of getting back to where we were, has been going through and scoping out the questions that we wanted to then lead into further study. So this is hoping to gear up for the formation of problem statements and data that we would then use to inform our own development of goals and strategies for recommended improvements in these areas. So that's kind of our workflow with this. And so we're kind of going from phase one, and then what we'll end up doing is coming back with additional rounds of information that we can then present to either the subcommittee or the full council to help us develop out goals and strategies for further action in kind of a more formal manner. But we're still kind of at the beginning. And so what we had done here is looking at specifically civic engagement or lack thereof, and how it affects young adults. So I'll pause there. I know that the notes that I've jotted down here were mostly from the discussion with Sujit and Jessica, and I think Denver was on the call as well. Do either of you want to kind of rehash kind of either these or add anything to them? And Dean, if you want to add to them, of course, feel free, because I think that there's always room for addition and refinement.
Yeah, and then just real quick, in terms of the age group and the definition of young adults, what is it again?
So for our council, it's a good question. For our council, in terms of our membership, that's one thing, but I think young adults, in terms of what we're looking at in particular, it's not well. So it's not something where we're only looking at a specific targeted demographic. I think that the demographic that we have that's eligible to participate as a member of this council is anywhere from, I believe, 18 to 34. And then but the young adult definition is, I think, for the purposes of what we're doing is kind of up to us.
Yeah.
So it's a solid
Okay.
question. I don't think that we
That
have
makes
a
sense because I know
position.
Penny mentioned it during the interview that she gave me a statistic that they looked at specifically around the ages. I think it was something like 34 to maybe 18, like similar to the one you mentioned. That's the number that they're looking to improve on. So I was wondering if that, in terms of these questions, are what kind of the age group we're looking to focus in on.
What was that age group that Penny mentioned, Dini? What were the bounds of that age group? Just out of curiosity.
I wish I wrote it. She mentioned specifically the age group, but I believe it could be on the statement that she also emailed me. So I could check my email on. She gave me a pretty interesting
No,
statistic
all good.
and mentioned that is kind of that's the age group that they're looking.
Well, typically, I'm sure you guys are familiar, but
to.
yeah. Can you guys hear me? Okay, there might just be some connection issue with Deanie, maybe, but yeah. So for young, for various groups, partisan or not, typically a young whatever is defined as 34 and under. I could include even like 12 to 13-year-olds, but I think for our purposes, probably like 18 to 34. But we probably adopted that kind of age group, maybe in the supervisor, because that's when you're 35, you quote unquote age out of like the young groups. So maybe that's a little more context.
Okay. Yeah, that does make sense. I see now also. Is there? I think I'm having connection issues.
Yeah, I was mostly just asking for curiosity's purpose. It was interesting that Supervisor Gross had personally identified a particular age group. I was just curious if that kind of matched our subcommittee's target as well. I'm sure it did, but I was just curious. We can keep moving though, Graham.
Sounds good. So I think the related question to this kind of question about civic engagement and how it affects young adults, we need to bring in the workforce talent. So I think generally speaking, it's kind of like the first question. And Deanie, just if you're having connection issues, sometimes stopping the video is the best way to do it because it just takes less bandwidth. So maybe test that out, see if that works. But why should we focus on talent attraction and retention? I know that's kind of the whole point of the council, let alone the subcommittee, but why are we doing this? why are we focusing on this? Clearly there's an issue at stake, but what are your perspectives on this particular thing? And I'll scribe, so don't feel like you need to write anything down. I'm happy to scribe, and we can take this and refine it, put it into something that's not note form by the time that we present it to the council.
I think the statistic is, I could be misquoting, but it's like a $12,000 to put a student through the FCS public schools. So we have an economic interest in keeping our SBS K through 12 graduates within the county. So we get an economic return. So I guess that's like a very obvious economic reason. And yeah, that's young people, you know. I am a product of FCS public schools, so.
I mean, I think at the core of it, right, like an educated and informed citizenry / workforce is the backbone of a society in a way, right? I think the better educated, the better qualified citizenry not only lead more healthy, more productive lives, but they also help invest in the next generation that can essentially sustain the future of a county. You know, the whole reason why committees or localities invest in the future, and I think the reason why that term is even coined is because they realize that the next generation are essentially the standard bearers for the future of that county and that locality. So I think it's literally within our economic, but also physical interests to be making sure that we have a workforce that is equipped and talented to handle the challenges of a society.
Especially in this modern age, like the 2020s or 2010s. I mean, our society has changed so rapidly with the introduction of technology and big data and the cloud and so much more. So it's really crucial that we retain our young talent in a rapidly modernizing world, so that Fairfax County continues to innovate and continues to stay on top of what's going on, I guess. It's not the great way to say it, but basically, yeah, we need young people to stay.
This is kind of getting at what you're saying there, Jessica, but there's also kind of a competition edge in the sense that we compete for talent. You know, we compete for residents of all ages and all abilities. You know, we always want more people to come here. But in particular, we compete for young adults and talent, workforce talent. So that's something that's very much kind of in our minds, is the perception that we're losing out to other jurisdictions, other places, not just our neighboring jurisdictions, but other metropolitan areas. Across the country, across the world, really. That there's this perception that we could be doing more to outcompete through better everything, better services, better opportunities, better attractions, whatever the case may be. So I think competition is something in particular that I know from the economic development world, they're always, it's a big piece of it, is trying to make sure that people come here as opposed to some other jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think the proportion of like people attraction and like workforce attraction has implications for every segment of society, right? Like not just the hiring and economic front, but even like the housing market. In terms, that's going to determine the volatility and dynamism of the local housing market, and will continue to define what it means to set an affordable place to live in an affordable community, not just a purely retention and talent attraction issue.
I think we're probably good on this question, right? Unless, do you need anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think we pretty much hit the nail on the head. I think one of the key things is just, in terms of retainment, I think the school system itself. I know you mentioned, the 12K, but I mean, I think COVID introduced also the idea that, a lot of students don't really have access to a lot of things. And I think Fairfax County specifically wasn't up to speed with other county. I know specifically Arlington was giving out, iPads and other electronic devices to all students. So I think with COVID-19 pandemic in itself, I think gave FCPS kind of the hit on the head to realize, hey, we need to start providing, in-home hotspot for a lot of students who don't have those things. And then also just in terms of school system, my sister recently moved out with her family, and the school system was the first thing she looked at. And I know Fairfax County is, taking these steps to, better the rankings that they are. But I think that's another key thing to in terms of the workforce attraction and retainment specifically. Well said.
Very good. And if I don't capture something properly, just say, hey, Graham, that's not what I said. So
That looks good to me.
Yeah. I'm jotting it down in real time, and so don't feel you can't that the way that you're spelling is incorrect, or you didn't capture the thought right. So I'm easy. All right, the next one that we had here was specifically related to education and participation. So I didn't want to go off of that one any further in trying to get into the talent attraction and retention. So kind of rephrased it slightly, and it's kind of getting to what Sujit has indicated, in terms of kind of having like a backbone of society and having kind of this the stall, your model citizen, I guess you could say. So I've slightly rephrased the question. Is there a connection between young adult attraction and retention and civic participation? So kind of leaving out the education, kind of taking that and thinking, frankly, it might just be self-evident. If you're participating, hopefully you're educated in civics. But is there a connection, you think, between retention and civic participation? And I say that because I'm not sure that it's obvious. It might not be true, but I'm just curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, I think so, because if more young people are participating civically, then more young voices are heard. And then that ripples up to hopefully we have more policies that make sense for young people, because policies are often shaped by the people who show up, by the people who make noise. And so if we can encourage young people that are already here to contribute, to show up, to advocate for their rights that as young people we know best the struggles we face. It's not just theory for us, it's our living lives. Then I certainly think that would help with attraction and retention. When you feel your government is listening to you and cares about you, then, and also if you're investing time to go, you probably are more inclined to keep staying.
I agree with Jessica on that one. I think, when it comes to people or young adults in the area who decide they want to, switch areas, I think there's a lot of reasons. Oh, maybe this area is too expensive. Maybe this area, there's too much traffic. There's a lot of factors that go into it. So getting involved early would make them more inclined to, or having a say in these factors, because they have no idea that, they're able to kind of change or dictate kind of the way things go in their local community. So getting in there early and seeming like you have a say within the community would, I think, motivate people to more likely stay, because the majority of times that I've noticed, or I think people have decided to leave the areas, that they're just unpleased with kind of the way things have turned out.
Yeah, I think there's a strong correlation between talent attraction and a dynamic civil society, right? To Deanie's point, people naturally gravitate to places where they feel that there's an active and dynamic and vibrant population who are in tune with the issues and are making their voices heard. And they're not just like this dormant kind of static society that isn't necessarily engaging with the outside world. And just due to the interconnected nature of the day, with social media being so as ubiquitous as it is, I think young people have a strong pulse on communities who are active and are I think almost change makers within the country. So I think there's a direct correlation.
Great, love it. And you know what we had here? We had 13,000 in investment.
Close.
Yeah, close. It's not going in the right direction. Let's just put it that way. So, right. What we had here, number 3, was what are the consequences of the status quo? So it's like, if we do nothing, what's business as usual? What are the consequences of that? It's almost kind of like a thought experiment. And so what I've done is kind of reformat that question ever so slightly for the attraction and retention. What are the current barriers to successful young adult retention and attraction? That we heard from the Economic Development Authority about of a lot of the stuff that they were doing in terms of strategies. And so without having to kind of remembering everything that they were talking to us about, but we can kind of come back to that at some point. But what do we think are kind of structurally some of the barriers that we have to retaining and attracting people, given our current status, and maybe absent some of the things that we're already trying? I think this is more kind of conceptual in nature. Because I'm sure that there are plenty of strategies that are working right now that we're also working on. You know, everything takes a lot of time. So
everyone says it, I think, who grows up here, but it's the commute. You know, it's like that's all. Even among my coworkers, it's like the one thing about DMV is the commute. It's really long, and the traffic is always horrible. And especially as a young person, you may not have a car yet. Like waiting on some often unreliable metro, or if there's even a metro near you, or then busing to the metro and then metroing to work. I mean, like we lose so many hours in a day just commuting in this area, and that's a big issue for young adults. Like a lot of my friends who go to different metropolitan areas go to places that are very walkable, that are very commute friendly in regards to public transit and fairly priced public transit and reliable public transit. So I don't know, as a person who grew up here, that's like always the complaint.
Yeah, it's a great point. And just to add to that final part of Jessica's answer there, the reliability of public transit. There's a reason why WMATA is not the New York City Transit Authority, in that the New York subway runs 24/7, whereas the WMATA closes at 11 p.m. And I think that factor alone, when people are deciding to kind of venture out and explore new places around the county, and they want a reliable means of public transportation to get about, they can't have the backdrop of a 11 p.m. shutdown kind of inhibiting that, right? That's not to speak ill of WMATA, the Metro, and public transit. I think they've made great strides, but having it reliable, having it fully functional, and having it accessible at all times is key.
So just for some history on WMATA and their funding. So WMATA is a regional coalition, but Virginia and Maryland cover most of the cost to support WMATA and their hours. We did a letter in the transportation subcommittee about the cuts to funding, but once upon a time, WMATA did run until about 2 a.m. Monday through Sunday, and was more effective, had better scheduling, but it comes down to funding. Something that we in Virginia are doing, and our local Northern Virginia Transportation Authority organizations doing, is to lobby DC government and the federal government to support WMATA and pay their share, because we recognize that the backbone of our federal government employees is the WMATA system, like the Metro system, but yet they don't pay anything into it. So that's a point of advocacy that's been going on for years, and recognizing that once we have the Metro up and running with normal schedules, with proper lines, then we can further have conversations of how we can enhance like the bus system to support the Metro system and whatnot, because currently there are a lot of initiatives in which we're using bus systems to go around WMATA, like the direct from the Fairfax County Government Center that goes directly into DC. In recognizing, you know, we might have to have county focused initiatives like Loudoun does as well, rather than support like relying on the Metro system.
I didn't know that. That's crazy that DC doesn't pay anything for it.
The federal government doesn't pay anything for it. So we're trying to get it with the federal government and recognizing that we are a hub for contractors and federal government workers. And that's why they're able to succeed. So the Fed should be putting in money towards the system. Yep.
Yeah, that totally makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing, Denver.
Denver, is that an accurate, I'm fairly unfamiliar with WMATA's funding structure. Is that an accurate bullet? I just want to make sure I'm capturing it properly. So a crucial error in there earlier, so I just want to make sure it's
I
We
can
we
read it.
we can noodle on it later too if you want to.
Okay.
All right. All right. So there's more to the transit, guys, but I agree. I think it's the big one. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, and I thought the presentations that we received on multimodal transportation that were presented to the YAC, I think a few meetings ago, I mean, that was extremely educational for me in terms of the investments and strides that we've made as a county on multimodal transportation and seeing what the Mosaic District did and seeing what the Creston Comprehensive Plan is factoring in terms of multimodal transportation. So I want to make the point that the city has recognized this as a problem, is I think very much doing their due diligence for it, but just as like an as-is point, I think it's a real issue that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later, you know? It, yeah. And just given like the limelight that like public infrastructure is commanding in the natural conversation and the emphasis on high-speed rail and accessible public rail that so many people use, I think it's just only going to, garner more limelight moving forward. And I'm sorry, one last anecdotal point. I apologize for rambling, but I've recently started biking to work, and I felt extremely appreciative and thankful that my job had a place where not only I could store my bike, but rent company bikes to move around and utilize on the weekends, and that the area where I lived uh, had had designated bikeways, and there was a WO&D trail, and the streets near my house catered to bikers. I know that it would immediately cast a negative light for me in terms of where I lived if I didn't have the chance to bike to work and have that option. I know that was a big factor for me. So just wanted to make that anecdotal point, and I'm sure that's the case with a lot of young people who don't want to deal with the hassle of a car and want to be able to move around in a different way, especially as people move to more urban areas. I think it's just an important point to keep in mind that it's a big hiring factor for people and counties.
Very good. Thanks, guys. What we can do in the interest of time, and we had kind of two parts to this. These are great. Maybe what we can do is I can send this around afterwards, and we can feel free to just fill in additional points in terms of barriers. But these are great transportation related factors, and they are barriers. I think they're probably ones that are perhaps the most impactful. Transportation impacts everything in Northern Virginia and in the DC area, that's for sure. All right. The next question was, what would enhanced outreach to young adults entail look like? And then who should do this? And then in terms of strategies, this is kind of where we're getting at, like, what would it look like to do enhanced attraction, retention of young adults? What would that look like? What are the strategies that would involve? And it's like a visioning thing. Like, what would it mean for the county to do this in a better way? What are the things that would need to be in place for us to have greater retention, greater attraction? And this could be greater things that do attract, or it could be strategies for attracting. So it can kind of be one or the other. We'll mix them all in.
Well, in addition to guess better, more reliable public transit. I think I mean these are all related to I think like the whole council as a whole, but affordable housing. You know, if I mean rent is just always too high, and there's so many. You know, and I know we talked about this at a different YAC meeting, but like with the empty units, just rent sometimes being artificially high, it makes it hard for folks who are just starting out in their career to find a place near enough to work, balance the commute, and rent, and then one day buy a property, which seems like impossible nowadays. I think like the average net worth of maybe the like millennials or like Gen Z starting to be is like less, was getting negative or something like that. Like it's not even. It's just like there's so much debt that young people have. So I mean, throughout a lot of things there, but um, transit and housing I think are key for young folks.
Yeah, and then for better or for worse, once you buy a house, you're kind of locked in for a little while, because you know you're in once you buy, you pay the real estate agent, and so it takes a couple of years to recoup that cost, unless the market's going gangbusters. So I don't know if that's tying somebody down just because of that is not necessarily the retention that I mean, but I think your point is exactly it, which is that, once you buy a house, I mean, that's a big deal, and people really do, they stick around. It's kind of an obvious thing, but it's not an insignificant thing, and that's important. And if we're not at the point, I think I'm going kind of Diego here, our fellow council member, but um, that's a really big factor, is wealth building opportunities for young people, and getting to that point where you can buy your first home in Fairfax. What does that look like? What's the median house go for these days in the county? It's quite a lot. So that's depressing. Millennials are declining net worth. I didn't know that. So.
Yeah, often I think that it's important to sometimes like set aside the technocratic, recommendations that like a lot of boards and councils and uh, groups, with great intentions put forward, and just almost focus on like the baseline, almost psychological needs of affordability and being able to live healthy lives where you are earning a decent wage to be able to live productive and meaningful lives, right? And at the end of the day, I think that comes down to affordability and wages and um, and Graham, right? To your point, wealth building opportunities. So I think it's terrific, and it's done with great intentions and the right intentions for us to be exploring, um, very kind of forward looking, almost, technocratic proposals around almost peripheral issues. But I think it's helpful for groups to kind of stay focused on that core challenge of affordability and housing and wages and being able to create opportunity. So it's just something I've been thinking and dwelling on lately.
I think another factor that affects young people is the ability for small businesses to open their business and stay in business. I think like Arlington has so many cool new like from restaurants to activities to other kinds of things. Like how can we attract those small businesses in Fairfax County? And there's also plenty of young people who want to be entrepreneurs but go elsewhere to start because it's too expensive here or they're just not supported enough. So I think opportunities for small business is also something that affects youth talent and retention.
It's a really important point, just like the entrepreneurship gap. I think everyone talks about the disparities in the entrepreneurship gap in between like genders and socioeconomic demographics, but I think it's super helpful for this subcommittee to focus on the entrepreneurship gap as a county, right? Because that's ultimately what we're here to do. And I think by evaluating it at the county level, we can even break it down into disparities that occur from a gender standpoint and from a demographic standpoint too. I'm forgetting the precise statistic, Jessica, but I think like 90% of businesses in this country are small businesses, and like a thriving small business community is a pretty strong indicator of a thriving society. Um, like you mentioned, Arlington is, I think, almost world, like at least country renowned for their small business environment. I'm not so sure that extends out to Fairfax County, but I think it's worth taking a closer look.
I know this is sports.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I know this is more like a federal issue as well, but also healthcare costs and like healthcare that it has to be heavily paid for or subsidized by businesses or other kinds of things. But and I know that's not really a county issue, but healthcare needs in general are definitely affect young folks, especially women too, for uh, many different types of healthcare that could be specific to people who have uteruses. So, yeah. Oh, and healthcare is, I think, is also uh, very related to small businesses. Because small businesses have to also pay that and try to compete with like the big business. Um, so, anyways, I think the healthcare issue is actually related and intertwined with small business issue as well.
Yeah, I think the final point I'd make here, and just to add to the healthcare point, is I think people also keep in mind what the environmental upside of a particular place is. Is a county or is a community prone to frequent storms and uh, weather events that will likely be exacerbated in the years ahead due to climate change? What does that mean for their home costs and repair costs um, and flooding insurance and things of that nature? So I think um, by focusing, if the last few years were any indication in terms of how the Southwest and Southeast parts of the country have just been battered, like no other years on record in terms of environmental damage, I think it's an important point for people factor in when they choose to establish roots somewhere in terms of, are they going to actually be able to stay uh, or are they going to be forced out because of environmental decisions.
I think that's a really important one. This is kind of anecdotal, of course, but I have my in-laws live in the Bay Area, and the big thing out there is the wildfires. Not necessarily tied to storm frequency, duration, intensity, but very much, a factor in terms of, people deciding to stay or go from an area that's, thriving. The Bay Area, it's otherwise it's a place that doesn't have necessarily, at least at the present, a problem with talent attraction and retention, but it's becoming more and more something that is talked about a lot. Is what do we do? It's the fire season starts earlier each year, but it does start to impact people's ability to or not their ability, but their decision of where do we want to live. So it is a big factor. And I know flooding is very much on the planning end of things. I'm sure Denver probably heard plenty of this when she was working for the Mill office, but flooding is very much a problem around here. A lot of the county was built up before our current regulations for stormwater management, and so with climate change, you have increased frequency, duration, intensity of storms, and in some cases, it's not mitigated by this infrastructure that we have to a degree that's going to allow for no loss of property or no damage to property. So it's a big problem. It's a structural problem that we have in the county. So it's not something that we don't take lightly either. There's a lot of work being done there, but I think this environmental thing isn't necessarily the obvious thing that people kind of point to in terms of workforce development, but I think it's very much something that they should. It's a very real thing. And healthcare, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Jessica, because healthcare costs, I mean, there are things, you're right that it is kind of a federal issue, but it's not something that can't be addressed at the local level too. There's very much programs that take place specifically at the local level to try to bring down costs and manage care in a better way. So those are both really good.
I was going to chime in. I'm not sure how quantifiable this really is, but in terms of kind of just the niche and kind of what FCPS is as a county, I feel like one thing that people look at it, I mean, it is very close to places like Arlington, places like DC. So I guess just looking at it like, hey, I want to go live in Fairfax County as opposed to like, I want to live in New York City. I want to live in San Francisco. I feel like there's more of a stigma around those places. That's more of like a youth, kind of like more like a up and coming city vibes, I guess. So I think in terms of this area, it's like, hey, 5 minutes down the road, the economic median is increasingly lower. People are, completely different demographic. People are completely different than you are. And then 5 minutes down the road, it's, it's a whole new area. So I just kind of like the general like consensus around the area and kind of what it is can also make people want to stay and or leave. Like, oh, I grew up and I lived here all my life, and I think going forward, I want to stay till I'm 30, 40, but like, how's that? Like, it just kind of just doesn't have that connotation around it. I guess what I'm trying to say. I mean, I know it's not really quantifiable, but I feel like it's something that people are looking to. I feel like there's a lot of negative stigma around Fairfax County as a whole, especially people who grew up in the area.
All right. Well, next, I think we have like basically more question in here, but I think one of the things that was mentioned a couple of times was some of the best practices from Arlington in particular, in terms of small businesses. So that's one thing in particular that I would not being somebody that's terribly familiar with small business programs. But that might be something that we could really look at is, what is, as you mentioned, Jessica, what is Arlington doing to try to attract and retain, small businesses in Arlington County, and what kind of success have they had, and what are the features of the programs that could be that we could look at here. So that's one thing that I'll definitely want to add to this is some counties examples. Are there other specific pieces of info, other data, presentations, best practices? And again, we can come back to this, and I'll send this around. So if you think of something in the middle of the night, feel free to.
I think
Go ahead, Jessica. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that racial inequity, systemic racial inequities also very much affect young people on our minds as well, from over policing of certain groups to any type of discrimination faced during growing up in public schools or Fairfax public schools or elsewhere. I think it's definitely worth bringing up for youth adult retention for the people who grew up here. Why did some leave? I have so many friends of color who experienced very questionable traffic stops or whatnot because of not necessarily any kind of actual traffic violation, and also accounts of unsavory experiences from certain teachers or principals while growing up. So I think, when we think of young people and why are people leaving or going, leaving or staying, I think systemic racial inequities must be brought up too.
So Graham, I was pretty impressed by some of the metrics that the strategic plan section under the effective and efficient government subsection identified as metrics to compile that would, I think, paint a wider picture about the current state of affairs and the strategies that the county would need to address and prioritize, right? Namely, I'm talking about like the percentage of residents who rate the overall quality and accessibility of Fairfax County government as excellent, or the percentage of residents who feel that they have authentic opportunities to participate in the decision-making train. So, metrics around community engagement, customer satisfaction, the county and school workforce, technology and facilities. I think all of these different indicators are going to be super telling, and I'm pretty excited to see what the final results are, because I think obviously that these likely require a longer lead time than we have in order to be reporting back, but I think these will be like very, very indicative of the direction and priorities that the county would need to set, not just for residents at large, but young adults in particular.
Yeah, I just reviewed the strategies again, and that brought up another point, that I think would help us continue to develop strategies, which is how we are treating our most vulnerable students as they go through school and then after. I grew up here. I have an older sister by 2 years and your brother by 2 years, and we are children of immigrants. And we didn't realize until my brother was in high school, I guess, and me as well, that we qualified for free lunches this entire time. So how are we also doing outreach to our most vulnerable communities, especially who are also communities of color, who parents may not, native language may not be English, or so how are we doing, how are we reaching out to folks who are settling down here and putting down roots here, but who may not know that their government has initiatives for them that would help them. And that's a young people issue too.
Yeah, I would certainly co-sign that. So Graham, I guess question, when is the county expecting to receive the results of this metric survey that they've put out? Because I think that could be super useful in terms of the decisions and the priorities that we set. I'm assuming it would be a little bit out of bounds in terms of the timeline that we're following, but just out of curiosity.
I'm not sure. I can check though with Amy and
Okay.
see what that is, but I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Sure.
Let me check. I do know that in terms of they've gone through several rounds of outreach on the draft plan thus far. I think they paused for much of their outreach, at least for 2020, and kind of did a reset during that time frame. But their current outreach and engagement on the draft strategic plan, kind of writ large, my understanding is that it extends through the summer, and that the board is looking to most likely adopt the strategic plan in the fall. And so in terms of our kind of ability to look at the strategies and provide comments on them, I think basically now, is kind of the time frame, spring and summer, in order to get something in that's impactful and allows for people to actually to review them. and allows the board to consider them, along with, because there are going to be a lot of other interests, and there's going to be a lot of input on this, seeing that it's kind of gearing up for this, it's kind of gearing up for the final round of adoption in the fall. So I think in terms of when we want to be doing this, it's basically kind of right now.
Okay.
And so it's I'm glad we was able to kind of illustrate what that meant in terms of the time frame, but I'll check with her on the metrics.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that we would see the results of those metrics in the final plan, given that they outlined them here, but I don't know if that's the exact approach, but yeah, I would love to follow up on that.
Okay. And it might be, this is another question for her, but it might be that those are implementation metrics. So once the strategy has been adopted, or strategic plan has been adopted, that the implementation of the plan will use those metrics in evaluating whether it's successful or not. So that might be the case that I can check back with her.
Yeah. So implementation versus a current state, essentially.
Yeah, but if you don't have a baseline to compare it to, then what good is it?
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. So, or it's not that good, but it doesn't help you to evaluate based on current conditions. Let's just put it that way.
Of course. Right.
Okay.
This is why I'm not a planner, Graham.
I think most of y'all, by the time that we do all these plannery types of things, you have to forgive me. I think with a planner brain, I can't help it. I think y'all will be honorary degree planners by the end of it if you don't have a formal degree. So, all right, we had one more thing on here, and we started to talk about it, which is equity considerations. I think that's a really important one that Jessica brought up in terms of kind of our outreach to the most vulnerable in our community, specifically students, and that they have knowledge of and are kind of able to take advantage of the initiatives and the programming and everything that we have to offer to ensure that they're taking advantage of the things that they're eligible for. But kind of also just more generally, what are the equity considerations for different strategies for attraction and retention? And kind of what I'm getting at here is, I think in my mind, I think of economic development, and this is kind of a conventional approach. You think about, how do I get this company that does this one thing? They make this widget, or they provide this service. How can we get their 200 employees to move from Kansas City to Fairfax County? And you think about it, it's kind of a conventional way of thinking about it. It's probably a 1990s way of thinking about it, but there's trade-offs. That's kind of the way that it's been done for a very long time. I'm sure that those in the economic development community would probably say we don't do it like that anymore. That's kind of a crude example, but there's what I'm trying to illustrate is that there's trade-offs in terms of going with a specific strategy. Just going in on big tech companies and trying to bring them in, that has equity considerations. Having any type of strategy can have some sort of implications from an equity standpoint, some good, some bad. Some pro-racial and social equity, some that are not. So in the light of One Fairfax, which is our social and racial equity initiative that we have, I want to make sure that we're addressing this, because it is very much, as you had said, Sujit, kind of in the light, important from the board's perspective too.
Well, I mean, bringing up One Fairfax, when we were building the people, choosing the people, when we're creating focus groups that relate to One Fairfax, how are we reaching out to the community, especially to longtime activists in the community, to invite them into these spaces, to ask them for their time, to go to them? If we want to create a truly One Fairfax, then we need everyone's perspectives, including those who do not know anything about civic engagement. Yeah, I guess that's basically the main point, is that when we are creating the groups that are directing the direction of One Fairfax, how are we including everyone in that discussion? Not just those who are normally already involved, but those who may not have time to be involved, don't have time to come to these types of meetings on a weeknight because they're working, or kids, or all sorts of other things. So, yeah.
and this kind of gets to the, I think, what I think of as the distinction between outreach and engagement. Outreach is kind of the crude, like, hitting the zebra with a baseball bat. It's easy. You send a letter. It is another crude example, right? But you send a letter, you send out a Facebook notice, it's active only in the sense that it's a one-way street. And you can target it. You can do it fairly well. You can do it on Nextdoor. You can tap shop and work with community leaders to try to get more equitable representation in terms of who you're reaching out to. But it only goes so far. Outreach is just one. It's the very beginning, and then there's engagement. And I think that in the distinction is, what do you do after outreach has happened? After you've reached out, what do you do with the person who says, that's interesting, or I hate this, or this is great and I want to get more involved? What do you do? Is it just bringing people to a community meeting and having a planner like myself, yap for an hour and a half, and then have a Q&A session at the end that's 10 minutes long? That's one thing. Or is it kind of ascending what we call the ladder of participation, so to speak? Do you step up in terms of enabling people to make more and more decisions from a citizen standpoint? So it's more about power than anything else. It's not just officials. It's not just representatives of the government making all the decisions, but how can you further engage people and allow them to have some efficacy, have greater efficacy, greater control over the decisions that are ultimately made? Because we live in a democracy, and it's one of these things that if you have people engaged in the process, the more power that you're handing to them, ideally, as long as your design is correct in terms of your outreach strategy and your engagement strategy, the better, because people are more directly involved. So
there's another a related point I want to bring up as well, is that I think for our young people and our vulnerable communities, and I think this is also a federal issue, but there's a growing lack of trust of those in authority, of those in government. And I mean, for some folks, it might be because of experiences with law enforcement, or it might be just this general belief that no one's listening to them, and that no one cares about them. So even as we do outreach and engagement, and we have like the Fairfax County government label, how are we also taking into considerations a lot of systemic oppression that's been in this country for long before we were even born? How are we being proactive about showing these communities that have been historically marginalized that we want to hear from them, that they can trust us, that we are trustworthy? And how are we proving that in our track record too? And addressing this point head on, instead of just assuming that we are trustworthy because we have a title next to our name, or or someone's at a certain office. I think we have to go a step further than that, and actively be like, this is how we're listening, or like, your privacy is protected this way when you reach out to us, and things that might seem obvious to someone who was born here. I was born here, but still, like, how are we doing that for our young folks and our vulnerable communities?
that's a really good one. It's important. I certainly feel it. The growing lack of trust. It's a real thing. I think it's not just at the local level. Like you said, Jessica, I think it's very much a countrywide problem. That's for sure. But people live in communities, and so this is one of the places that you feel that, but then you also have the opportunities to build that trust. So, and you also have the ability pretty quickly to break it. So it's and that's actually a lot easier than you'd think.
Yeah. Even though I grew up here, went to these schools, I think like in US history or world history or whatnot, I never was made aware that I could reach out to my supervisor. I think in middle school civics, there was some emphasis on you can write letters to your congressperson, but there was never discussion about local. To me, all politics is local. You know, it all starts here. And I felt like if I had known, especially like when I was applying to colleges or whatnot, that, you know, I could affect change as well very locally in a way that's like, quote unquote, like not as sexy as federal politics, you know, like not, doesn't have the national headlines about different initiatives Fairfax County is doing for equity and inclusion, but it matters. And the voices of our young folks matter. Um, yeah.
To add to that point, I think in terms of just the certain outreach groups and communities, I think there's just a disconnect. I think just not just in these recent, I think I would say 4 or 5 years specifically, how much have changed, but I think just the people who are in power and the people who hold the authority, there's a reason why the change is taking so long. I think it's because a lot of these people in authority don't really, aren't really used to these things. So it's kind of difficult, from the ground up to get these things down. So I think, yeah, definitely like what Jessica mentioned, I think there should be more of a focus on communities and reaching out to those certain outreach communities and groups because with people who are more familiar with kind of what's going on with their day-to-day life and more familiar with kind of the problems at hand because I think from the top to the bottom, there just is this a strong disconnect right now.
Even taxes, I think, are just like a very nebulous thing to most people, even though there's federal and there's state taxes and there's also county, you know, but everyone's just like, all these taxes, but no one, and that's an easy way to tell people like, hey, get involved, taxes, I don't know, but everyone sees on their paycheck every 2 weeks or whatnot, and it's always on people's minds, but people never think to reach out to their supervisor or reach out to their local government and understand where that money is being used, like how, and that is being used well. And I think that was part of the links that were sent to us about the strategies and stuff like that. But also, how can we communicate that we're using their money well, and it's also their money, and they should reap the benefits of their community centers or other things. So yeah, I think that was a few points there as well. But until I was very actively engaged through a friend, in like local partisan politics, I had no idea, that I could reach out, or that these local positions that are very, very local matter a lot for my day-to-day life, more so, much more so than like a presidential election. So again, a lot of different points here, but it definitely is a youth issue as well.
Yeah, it is, and not just for homeowners. I think we were talking about this idea that once you buy a home, you're really kind of cemented in the community. Because you're here and you put down your roots. From a financial standpoint, but renters pay taxes too. It's just wrapped into your rent. So it's you talk about the paycheck, right? It's not as easy to see the fact that you're paying real estate taxes, for example, because you're not the one actually handing over the check. But there very much is, both from a like a local sales tax perspective. Your state sales tax. I think I don't know the exact number, but I think it's perhaps like 1% or so returns back to the actual locality in Virginia. So you are paying taxes to Fairfax County, absolutely, both as a renter and as a homeowner. So it's very much a real thing. Every time you buy something, every time you move. So it is very much that you should be more actively engaged in where the money goes. That's for sure.
Also just like awareness that, these are funding the parks, or these are funding, where did the taxes to Fairfax County government go? I feel like if people worked here for a few years and were also made aware of that they're paying taxes and this is how it's being used, they're helping the kids here, the schools here, the teachers here, all the government staff here, and your taxes are enabling them to do these great things. That might also help connect the dots for most folks and feel more connected to their community, to people they will never meet or may never meet, but they can feel like they're a part of something bigger. I feel like that kind of aspect of community has been lost, and that's not just a local thing, it's not a state thing, a national thing, it's a global thing, I think. But at least for our country, I really see that among many communities across the place, just this loss of sense of community, of belonging, of yeah, and that's a bigger problem as well with technology, especially. But I think it's worth a mention in regards to especially young people feeling more and more separated from other people, whether that's social media, of course, national issue as well. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think just one final point I'd make here is, all of these were terrific suggestions and really, I think, astute observations. And it leads me to think that ultimately personnel is policy in a way, in that the quality and the diversity of the personnel who are setting the policies inside the government are ultimately going to dictate the quality and outcomes that a particular government will eventually churn out. So I think really revamp. I don't want to say revamp because I'm actually very proud of the level of civil service that we have in Fairfax County. I think like uh, re, placing a larger spotlight on hiring people of lived experience into the government, a wider diversity of people into the Fairfax County government, from young to old, people within the disability community, people from the immigrant community who can attest to the hardships that they or their kids encountered when they were growing up and not being able to understand what the school teacher wrote home on a piece of paper, and hiring people into the civil service who I think can contribute this sense of lived experience while also highlighting their strengths and being able to contribute to the decision-making process within super technocratic but equally as important departments like the Bureau of Tax Collection, or even the Environmental Quality Office, can do a major service to the type of results and outcomes that that people receive. It makes me think, and Graham, I don't mean to make you blush, but I think one of the reasons why we have a council like the YAC and subcommittees like this were because they hired young people and millennials who had lived experience and wanted to kind of rope in other constituents to start thinking about these issues in an official capacity. So I feel like if we can really, first of all, thank the people who are working within the government, but also make it more of an attractive place to work, I think it could fundamentally reshape the type of outcomes that we as a county are providing. So just a final thought I had there.
Yeah, you might make me blush at some point, but not just then. I do blush from time to time. So I will say that from a one of the things that in the planning department, and I think you've heard Casey say this in the past, that when we do outreach and engagement, we definitely try as best as we can to do outreach to the communities that are most affected by planning department decisions. So rezoning applications, plan amendments, these kinds of things that that we deal with. The thing that we do not get, and I say do not, meaning like we almost never get, are young adult perspectives. Almost never. There's reasons for that. I think some of them are fairly obvious, and some of them kind of spelled out in terms of why that takes place. But it's something that is very very obvious when you go to a community meeting. And so, I mean, when we think about equity, I think we traditionally kind of think think of equity, at least I do, from a racial, social, economic background, but I think that there are equity implications for the intergenerational equity. And I think we typically think of it as older people are being disadvantaged and disenfranchised. Well, in some cases, it's probably the opposite too. So I think that there is kind of this greater question of equity in terms of who are we reaching out to from a county standpoint, not just from a racial standpoint, not just from a socioeconomic background perspective, but are we getting that diversity in terms of age? And so I think that we're trying to build it out so that it's not quite as obvious, and it's not quite in the direction necessarily that is always kind of assumed, but it is very much an important factor because it's a missing that we frankly just do not hear from almost ever. It's rare, let's just put it that way, and it's very much noticed. I think Denver probably noticed it when we did the when she talked to the planning commission, testified at the planning commission about ZMOD. It made a big splash. So, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah, I think hopefully if we maintain the accessibility that having online options for various different government functions, if we keep that going forward, if we make online an option, I know that's been talked about YAP wide, but I think it will make a big difference. It's really hard for young people to go out to somewhere random at like 7 or 8 p.m. on a weeknight in addition to working, or whether they work different shifts or whatnot. You know, I think especially nowadays, young people are more and more engaged, especially Gen Z, due to all of the school shootings and whatnot. Like sadly, a lot of our youngest folks haven't had a choice but to pay attention, haven't had a choice but to care. So I really hope, you know, and this was talked about at YAC in general, that we continue to make having our voices heard and being part of the discussion as accessible as possible for young people. And that definitely includes an online option, a call-in option. Maybe someday, like maybe a form of podcast or whatever, what's going on. I don't know. Podcasts are very popular among young folks, though I don't listen to any, but still, you know, so.
Podcast, a live stream, or something along those lines. I know that one of the options we've been looking at is this platform called Public Input, which allows you to live stream meetings. So that's not, you can basically go to a website and it's a live streaming thing. So if you're not able to in the meeting proper, but you just kind of want to watch, then you have this live stream option that you can. I think it runs through YouTube, but I'm not sure. So it's kind of like a Facebook Live thing. So. I will say, I know that we had talked about hybrid meetings at the last full council meeting. We got word today that we might actually be able to keep going with online. I see my fingers that thing changes again, but it very well might be that even post July that we're able to keep an option. Because I hear you, and it's not easy to get everybody to come out to any location, especially for a group that's countywide. It's one thing if you're focusing on like one particular little area where everybody lives near it, but it's difficult. It's difficult to get everybody to come out to the government center, for example. So. Yeah,
especially considering the metro accessibility of even the government center.
Yeah, and the bus stops running at 9 p.m. or so. So it's not easy. All right, well, that's great. We are a bit over our time that we had allotted. We can keep going if you'd like. I think we had one additional thing that we wanted to do, but I just wanted to do a time check since it's now 8:22. I'm happy to keep going for as long as you guys like. But if you want to pause here and pick it up at another time, that's totally fine too. So just let me know what you'd like to do.
What was the next thing again?
I was looking at the strategic plan, the specific strategies.
I personally feel like that's a longer discussion, so maybe we can table it for next time, but have the next meeting more sooner than 4 months. So next month, yeah. So I'm okay with tabling it. I don't know how others feel.
Yeah, I would concur. I think that definitely warrants a longer discussion with, yeah.
Okay, that's fine with me. Maybe what we can do is just plan to pick it up at the July meeting. So if we want to keep the same Thursday timeframe, then we'd be looking at the first Thursday of the month, which would be July the 1st. So I know that's the weekend before July 4th, but as long as if that works for everybody, we can keep that. And that would still allow for plenty of time for us to be able to review the strategies and then provide comments to the strategic planning office in time for it to be considered and everything like that. So if you'd like to do that, that'd be ideal. I think we had talked last time about typically BACs do not meet in August unless there's like a very compelling reason. Planning commission stops, board stops, most of the BACs stop for August to allow for essentially a recess. But we do have July, so we have some time to be able to raise this specific thing regarding strategic plan prior to the the hearings that will take place in the fall. All right. Okay. Well, unless there's anything else, I think the only other things that we had on the agenda were announcements. So are there any announcements from anybody? I'm picking up the chat here because it looks like I haven't been up. It's very difficult for me to follow the chat and when I'm sharing my screen. So
I think everyone received an email about the One Fairfax policy and folks having to review the policy. That's my only announcement. That policy, watch the 30-minute video and then say that we as a board and board members agree with the policy.
There was an email?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I received that one.
I will.
Got it.
I'll forward it. I'll forward it along to you. You don't have to agree to it, but you do have to acknowledge that you've received it.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I got it.
Yeah, me neither.
I'll forward it along to you. But yeah, it's an acknowledgement of the One Fairfax policy. So it's something that all of the BACs are required to take a look at. It's just it's an acknowledgement of what it is. I know that we've mentioned it a couple of times. And Denver, don't mean to put you on the spot, but it might be a good thing to bring to the full council at some point is a discussion of One Fairfax, since it is so central to both the strategic plan, the budget, and essentially the priorities of so much of what the county is working on these days. So
Absolutely. And yeah, no, I think that's a good thing. And right now it's kind of more of a vision statement instead of a lightning rod for folks to act upon and, take the energy from. So I think we definitely can give some insight and be part of that. So yeah, that sounds great.
okay, very good. Well, I'll make some calls and see if there's somebody from the One Fairfax office that might be able to come and do a presentation, because I think that'd be a really good thing to do, and it'd be pretty timely too. Yeah. All right. Well, Susan, it's up to you. You are the chair of this group, so the floor is yours, sir.
No final announcements. I just want to thank everybody. I mean, each successive discussion keeps getting better and better and increasingly substantive. So I can't wait to keep ramping up and continuing to produce results here. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And thanks a lot, Graham, for note-taking as well, and just
Yes, thank you, Graham.
awesome.
You lost without the notes.
8 p.m. on a weekday.
Wipe us away from public memories. So cheers to you, sir.
No problem. Well, if I mischaracterize something in here, just don't hunt me down. Just let me know. Hey, Graham, you didn't get that right. So just make sure that I'm capturing your thoughts properly, because they are good, but I just want to make sure that they're correct. So I'll send them around. Just probably just a couple minutes just to get off the call, so you can take a look. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.